won't find Elsewhere, Kentucky on any map. The roads leading there have been erased, the satellite images blurred as if someone or something wanted to make sure it was forgotten. But forgotten places tend to have the darkest secrets.
Tonight, on the Other Side podcast, we are diving into the chilling mystery of Elsewhere, Kentucky, an abandoned settlement in Callaway County that seems to only exist in whispers of old stories. A town that vanished under strange circumstances, a schoolhouse with a history so grim that those who enter don't always come back, and a ghost story that is far too real for comfort. What happened in Elsewhere? Why did the county cut it off from the rest of the world? And what truth lingers in the ruins today? Turn off the lights, slip into your fluffy bunny slippers, turn up the volume, and join us as we step into the forgotten town of Elsewhere, Kentucky, where history fades, but the hauntings remain. All credit for this story goes to Reddit user xXylophone_X. If you enjoy this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcast, follow and leave a 5-star rating and review. I would greatly appreciate that, and that helps me out a lot. Let's dive into it. You won't find Elsewhere, Kentucky on any map. The overgrown gravel road leading to the abandoned settlement doesn't even connect to a main road. As with most places you shouldn't go, even the Google satellite images have been scrubbed with what looks like a bad use of a blur tool in an otherwise detailed area. It was located in southeastern Callaway County, just off the shore of Kentucky Lake. Elsewhere sat surrounded by forest. Until recently, several buildings remained. I've heard stories about Elsewhere growing up. Being a Callaway County native, I've heard most of the local folklore and ghost stories. I spent several nights in Osbury and Old Salem cemeteries looking to verify stories of creepy ghosts and the various monsters that we talked about around the campfires. The most I've ever gotten was spooked friends and a bad case of the willies. I was volunteering at the senior center when a man named Earl, who was about 80 years old, told me the story about the fall of Elsewhere. It went like this.
When I was a boy, my pa and I went to the Elsewhere General Store to get some rock candy and chicken feed. I stood outside while pa talked to Miss Ellison, the shopkeep. Pa loaded the feed into the truck and handed me the candy. Right about then, there was this loud scream from the schoolhouse. I don't know right well what happened because Pa told me to stay in the truck. But after that, we never went back to Elsewhere. When I was a few years older, I went back there with some friends. We were just dumb kids fooling around. My friend Jason went inside the schoolhouse, and I never saw him again. We spent the rest of the day looking for him, but we never found him. Later, the police did a search, but they also found nothing. Shortly after that, the county disconnected the road between Elsewhere and Highway 280. It's been about 60 years, and you're the first person to mention that place to me in half a century, son. I warn you not to go there.
I did some digging after that. The Callaway County Public Library has a pretty good archive of town history and folklore. I had read every book on the subject, but I'd never seen mention of Elsewhere. I ended up at the Waterfield Library, up on the Murray State University campus, looking through some old microfilm, when I finally found a reference to Elsewhere in the Louisville Courier-Journal. A single paragraph story covered how an unincorporated town was being abandoned for health and safety reasons. It was dated April 2nd, 1953, and there was one detail that stood out.
Located 2 miles north of New Concord, just off of Highway 280.
I waited until Saturday morning, and I made sure to charge my cell phone before parking roughly 2 miles north of New Concord, just off the side of the road. I moved about 50 yards past the tree line, and I hiked back and forth until I found the remains of Elsewhere Road. I followed it northeast for about half a mile before coming into a clearing where several dilapidated buildings stood over the tall grass and broken pavement. I moved closer to the center of town when I saw a sign to my left that read Elsewhere General Store. The windows were boarded up and the door was nailed shut, but after pulling at the boards for a few minutes, I was able to pry the door open. The weathered wood was so brittle that it popped right off and left the nails in place. I was really surprised to see that there was any goods left on the shelf in this place. Old canned goods sat rusted on old wooden shelves, and an old-timey cash register sat on the counter, and on my left, several burlap sacks lay tattered across the floor. I pressed a few keys on the old mechanical cash register and I pulled the lever to reveal several tarnished coins and some paper money. I had a sandwich in a Ziploc bag that I had brought for lunch, and I decided to go ahead and have the sandwich before putting the old money in the bag and stuffing it in my backpack. I moved toward the back of the store when an unexpected noise caused me to stand at attention. I caught the distinct sound of footsteps on the wooden porch of the general store. I turned around and peered out the door, only to see nothing. I called out,
"Hello? Anyone there?"
but there was no response. I crept toward the door slowly with my hands out in front of me, just in case. I slowly peeked around each corner before verifying that nobody was standing outside, and I made my way back out to the street. I was sufficiently creeped the fuck out at that point. I decided to pack it in and come back later with friends. It was just about then when I heard the crack of thunder. The weather app on my phone said that there was a 0% chance of rain, but lo and behold, the clouds overhead were moving fast. I thought about hoofing it the half mile in the rain, but the rain came fast. Not wanting to go back into the general store, I darted into the nearest building, an old abandoned house. The front door was unlocked, and the door opened on the second pull. Standing in the parlor of this old house, I looked around at the old furniture and dusty floors, and decided to sit for a second on the old wooden chair that seemed sturdy enough. The storm raged outside, and I could see water coming in from the ceiling. Several old papers were sitting on the coffee table in the living room, and after a while, I went to go look at them. The yellow papers were single-page editions of an old periodical called the Elsewhere Gazette. The stories covered church events, pie recipes, and an advert for the Elsewhere General Store. One of the papers in the stack bore the headline,
"Tragedy in the Schoolhouse."
The article told the story of a hysterical schoolteacher who had poisoned the cake that she had prepared for the students. One surviving student ran out of the schoolhouse screaming when the woman tried to force him to eat some poisoned cake. It was dated August 12th, 1936. Earl's story put him there nearly 20 years later, and I was curious as to what could have happened some 20 years after the tragedy, but not entirely willing to continue investigating. When the rain let up a little, I trudged my way back toward my car, and around the time I got halfway down Elsewhere Road, the sky cleared up and the rain stopped. When I got back to Highway 280, I marked the spot with a couple fallen branches propped up against a tree, and I drove back in the town. That night I was sitting at Mary's kitchen nursing a cup of coffee when Jerry came in and sat at the old table adjacent to mine. Jerry and I don't talk much, but we find ourselves sitting here often at the midnight hour drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes. He tapped me on the shoulder and he said,
"You look like you saw a ghost, kid."
And I shook my head and I said,
"I didn't see one, but I'm pretty sure I heard one."
He got a confused look on his face and I continued,
"I did some hiking out by Elsewhere this morning."
Jerry's face went pale and he said,
"Bullshit."
I showed him a couple pictures on my phone and he replied,
"See that building right there?"
he said, pointing at my phone.
"Don't you ever fucking go in that building. Ever."
I replied.
I take it that's the schoolhouse.
He nodded and I continued.
What's the big deal with this place? Earl up at the senior center said he didn't know what happened, and I found an old newspaper article from about 20 years before Earl was there, but it didn't explain the scream he heard coming in from the 50s.
Jerry shook his head and he said,
Round here, we don't talk about elsewhere in polite conversation. If it ain't one of those things that needs discussing, we don't discuss it. But I can tell you're curious, so I'll tell you. Then we'll leave it be.
I nodded. Jerry continued.
I was born in '59, about 60 years after they abandoned the town. It was the '70s by the time I was a dumb teenager looking for a thrill. My buddy, Tommy Blankenship, found a picture elsewhere in a book up at the library, saying the town was abandoned in a hurry for some reason. We drove his truck out there and found everything boarded up, save for the schoolhouse. Tommy went inside and I stood by the truck. You could still get to Elsewhere Road if you didn't mind driving over some saplings at that point.
Jerry lit a cigarette and took a drag before continuing.
Tom let out this wail, like he'd been bitten by a snake, and I rushed up to the schoolhouse expecting to see God knows what. The single-room schoolhouse was empty, and I looked all around for Tom, but I couldn't find him. I ended up going to the cops, and that's when they told me about the ghost.
Jerry took a long drag from his cigarette, stood up from his chair, and then moved to the seat across from me. There was a somber look in his eyes that told me everything I needed to know about Tom's fate. He said in a hushed tone,
So the deputy, he tells me that every couple years some idiot goes in there and goes into the schoolhouse, only for nobody to ever see them again. The thing is, the county sheriff's department knows about the ghost. He told me back in the 50s this kid came to the school with a machete and he hacked up a couple kids pretty good. The school teacher ran outside screaming, and when they questioned the kid, he said that this pretty lady that he saw standing outside the schoolhouse from time to time said it would send them to heaven. They ended up putting the jail on top of him.
Jerry put out his cigarette and looked at me with a stern face.
I don't know what happens to people that go out into that schoolhouse, and I don't want to know. But for you, son, don't fucking go back there. The county should have demolished that hellhole.
And with that, Jerry left a $5 bill on his table and walked out. Despite his heartfelt story, I felt more curious about Elsewhere at that point. I paid for my coffee and I headed out. By the following Saturday, I was able to wrangle a friend to come with me back to Elsewhere. Katie was a local college student who was obsessed with ghost hunting in abandoned towns. It wasn't very hard to rope her into coming along. I told her stories as they had been passed down to me, and that was all it took for her to wake up at 5 a.m. on Saturday morning with a coffee and a camera, ready to go hiking. Katie and I strolled into town a little after 7 in the morning. The sky was bright, but the sun was still barely over the trees. We decided to open the doors to the schoolhouse and look inside from a few feet back, trying to play it safe. I opened the doors and I shot back off the stoop and back into the grass. It was so dark inside that we couldn't make anything out. Katie produced a flashlight and shined it inside the doorway. I could make out a few upturned desks and a chalkboard in the back. But as we stood there, the sun began to creep over the trees and it started to heat up the morning dew, resulting in a thick fog. I turned to my left for a moment to look back at the general store, when Katie darted past me and into the schoolhouse. I ran right beside her, and we both stood in the dilapidated building as I begged her to go back outside. She responded,
I could have sworn I saw a kid standing in here.
And I said,
"Yeah, that's great. Spooky kids. First time I was here, it rained out of nowhere. Now it's fog. We gotta get the fuck out of here."
Katie walked a few steps forward and let out a yelp as she fell through a hole in the floorboards to the cellar down below. I laid flat on the ground and reached my arm down to help her climb up. She grabbed my wrist and I grabbed her with the other hand, and I tried to roll back and pull her up, but she absolutely wouldn't budge. I looked down and I saw this halfway transparent woman holding on to her legs and pulling her into the darkness. I pulled harder as Katie started screaming, and the ghostly woman looked up at me and smiled in the dim light of the morning shining through the door. Katie was pulled quickly into the darkness, and in the struggle, I was pulled down into the cellar as well. Katie's screams fell silent as I pulled a couple of glow sticks out of my backpack and cracked them open. I tossed one in Katie's direction and one toward the other end of the room, and I brought a flashlight app up on my phone. Katie sat slumped against the wall on the far side of the room, and there were bones all over the room in various states of decay. I walked over to Katie and checked her pulse at the neck. It was faint, but it was there. And I turned toward the back of the room when I noticed a small sliver of light coming from the 2 wooden cellar doors about 20 or so feet in front of me. I crept past the scattered bones and over to the cellar door. I pushed them open only to hear chains rattle on the other side. I pushed harder and kept banging at them until one of the hinges broke, and then soon the other one did. I pushed the doors open and I went back for Katie and threw her over my shoulder. As I was walking toward the opening to the outside, I felt a sharp pain across my back. I didn't look back and I bolted for the light. I tripped over one of the corpses and fell to the ground. My cell phone slid across the floor. I looked back and the ghostly woman was almost on top of me. I grabbed Katie by the wrist and took off for the stairs, leading her to freedom and dragging the young co-ed behind me. Just as I crossed the threshold into the light, I felt a tug and I looked back to see the woman holding Katie by the leg. I tugged and pulled and cursed and fought, but this otherworldly voice from the apparition came out and said,
"Let her go to heaven."
I shot back,
"Go to hell."
and the woman's grip on Katie loosened as I fell back into the soft grass with Katie landing on top of me. I didn't wait around. A fireman carried her back to my car and she came to about halfway through the ride to the police station. In my report to the deputies, I mentioned all the bodies that I'd found down there. He would later tell me that they recovered 16 skeletons and 1 corpse that had been there for only a few years. The county board voted to demolish the town shortly thereafter. It was kept hush-hush. Elsewhere Road was tilled with a backhoe after the remaining buildings were bulldozed, and the cellar of the schoolhouse was filled with concrete. I went back out there one last time to make sure it was gone, and I didn't make it 5 feet from the tree line before a sheriff's deputy flashed his lights at me and told me to get back in the car. Katie won't talk to me anymore. Last I saw her, she pretended that she hadn't seen me and scurried away. Of all the things I experienced in that town, I regret not grabbing my cell phone. I had some pretty decent pictures, and as of now, there's no record of Elsewhere, Kentucky. Now, there's nothing left. Haven't been back, and from the way it sounds the county handled it, I don't think there's anything to go back to. But just in case, don't go to Elsewhere, Kentucky. You won't find Elsewhere, Kentucky on any map, but if you listen closely, the story is still being told. Abandoned roads, eerie disappearances, and a schoolhouse with a history too dark to be forgotten. What really happened in Elsewhere? Is it just another town lost in time? Or is something still lurking among the ruins? Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoyed that episode, do not forget to follow the Other Side podcast on whatever platform you're listening or watching on. If you want more unsettling and strange stories, make sure you leave a like or a 5-star rating and review. And if you have a local legend or a mystery that you want us to cover, reach out to us on social media in the comments down below or shoot us an email that is located on our YouTube channel. All of the links are going to be in the description down below.